Hey, oops. Hello, hello. I'm Jason of Diet Tom's Diet Toms. Uh, Greetings to all you YouTube people who still haven't seen my face. If you didn't know, I've been really active at twitch.tv/Diet Toms lately. I stream Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays at 8 Pacific time. Um, and we do really fun stuff. We do a lot of DIC microscopy, look at stuff like this. This is live as well. And well, it's just a ton of fun. It's been pretty poppin', pretty good success for me. And so I invite you to come over to Twitch sometime if you can make it. But a while back, we actually put down the super advanced DIC microscope and switched to just a simple amateur grade microscope. And I wanted to show off sort of some of the theory behind just basic microscopy, some kind of fundamentals for using a microscope properly, and then some techniques that I use to really enhance the imagery when using an amateur grade microscope, including one technique that I call it like advanced oblique is kind of what I generally call it, that delivers really, really stunning results. So I wanted to put those videos here on YouTube just as a, for reference for people that missed the stream. And I have trimmed them down a little bit, so it's mostly content throughout. I think the stream was about an hour and a half long, and it's not even half an hour, I think, for all the videos. So that's what you're about to see. It's a different format than what I usually put on YouTube, and that's why. So thanks for watching, and I hope you consider coming over to the Twitch stream sometime and sitting down with me. So, all right, let's get started. So, reviewing this Hydra right now in what is sort of the out-of-the-box standard mode of a microscope. So this is let's start with in general what this microscope is. This is the Bully Optics biological trinocular microscope or something. It doesn't have a very compelling name. And but it's one of the microscopes that I most highly recommend. It's just a really good deal for what it is. It's trinocular, so it's got a camera up on the top, or a camera port up on the top. And it is a finite microscope, so it has 160 millimeter objectives. We're not going to talk about that today, but it's basically a nice starter microscope. And these kinds of microscopes are in general called transmitted light microscopes. And the idea being that we have light down below and we are transmitting it through our sample and then imaging that light. So there are other microscopes. There are reflected light microscopes or episcopic illumination microscopes. And those microscopes shine light down and look at the reflected light. And that's usually mostly used for like metallurgy and whatnot. And then so the standard mode, the kind of the most basic mode of a transmitted light microscope is what we're seeing now, and it's called Brightfield. And so in Brightfield, your background, your field, your neutral field, if you don't have anything in the frame, is bright. And things that you're imaging will darken that bright field and change the color. And so I like to think of bright field imaging kind of like looking at your specimen acts kind of like a stained glass window. And so outside you have the sunlight, pure and white, and then whatever color your specimens are, and maybe there's some really dark stuff that just totally obscures the light. That changes the what you see, how the light appears to you. Where'd that Hydra get off to? There we go. So, Dishonored, I'm assuming this is kind of like what you first saw when you booted up your microscope. And in general, when you buy a new amateur grade microscope that I recommend, it'll have a condenser, which is adjustable up and down, just like this. And then on that condenser, there is a lever on the side, which controls the iris. And generally speaking, these things are pretty well set so that the best position for them in Brightfield is just all the way up until you can't actually turn it anymore. You'll know if it goes too far if it actually like hits the slide and bumps it out. So the first thing I would say is that generally speaking, you don't want to mess with your condenser position too much. It's going to be where it's meant to be when it's all the way up. But one thing you do want to mess with is the iris. And this is probably the number one most like misused function on the microscope, is the iris in Brightfield. Because, well, the iris, closing it down does a few things. And one of the things that it does is increase the depth of focus. So you can see that when I open it all the way, that tentacle in the background is just barely visible as a blur. And if I close it all the way, then that tentacle in the background is still blurry, but you can more clearly see it. And so a lot of people kind of, they get their microscope and they figure out that the iris does this, and then they leave the iris closed like almost all the time. And so many videos that you see people posting, when they just got a microscope, they look like this. And I don't want to say that this is like god awful or anything like that. There are some drawbacks to closing down the iris. And in fact, in all of optics, there are always trade-offs. Anytime you try to improve one thing, you lose something else. So for instance, Tom's Attack, I know, is a photographer, and some of you might be photographers or have some experience with photography. And in photography, there's something called the F number, right? And there's an iris that you control on the camera. And one thing that a lot of photographers are familiar with is that when you close down that iris really far, your image becomes less sharp. And it turns out the same thing happens on a microscope. When you close down the iris, the image becomes less sharp. Now it does increase in contrast, so things become darker on the Brightfield, but the lines actually get larger. And so that's the reason why, it's hard to say, things just look a little odd when you close down the iris a whole lot. They get these weird outlines to them. And if you just open the iris, if you close it down a lot, and then with the 10x objective, you just open it up a little bit more, you'll get something that looks a whole lot more natural. You'll get outlines that make more sense. And that kind of continues as you open up the iris more and more. You'll get a more crisp image that looks realistic, as opposed to some kind of weird filtered image. And like I said, you do trade off depth of focus when you do that. But it is generally there's a middle ground to be had. So again, I'll just come back here on this static thing here. I'm just going to close the iris down all the way, and let's see. If you look at the chloroplasts in there, you can see they're really well defined. They have these outlines that kind of don't make sense for chloroplasts. And if I open this up a bit, the chloroplasts are less well defined, but they don't have those weird outlines anymore. This is more of a natural representation. So the other thing to notice is that I'm going to open the iris all the way here, and we can take a look at this green hydra, and we can see that it is green. Can't see that. But if we close the iris all the way down, notice how we lost a lot of that color. and that is actually a real thing that is happening. There's a good explanation for why that happens. And so when you close down the iris like this, you also tend to lose color. Things aren't as vibrant. So one of the ways